Welcome to the Nation ASEAN Plus. I'm NADIA ABDUL. As the 47th ASEAN Summit takes place here in Kuala Lumpur, today we discuss investing in ASEAN, the next decade of regional growth. Joining me, Dr. Tan Chee Meng, Assistant Professor in Business Economics, University Nottingham, Malaysia. But just before we head to Dr. Chee, earlier today, Jessie Chahal spoke to Malaysia's Foreign Minister, Dato' Sri Utama Muhammad bin Hassan, as we talk about the goals for the summit, Malaysia's drive to turn ASEAN's Vision 2045 from plan to practice. Here's Jessie from KLCC moments ago.
ASEAN as a whole as well, there's a lot of points of discussion from security to tariffs and trade and beyond. What are some of your views outward looking, and what do you hope by the end of this summit will be some salient points that can come out of these conversations and agreements?
There will be more than 80 over outcomes. Deliverables will be discussed, and also the outcome will be announced, MOUs. Especially the main thing for ASEAN is that we want to ensure that this community vision community for 2045, that is to be, Malaysia will be the permanent shepherd for that, and we must make sure that agenda on the ASEAN community 2045 is really been addressed in phases. The first phase will be in connectivity. The second phase is about the economic activities among ASEAN, because the intra-ASEAN trade is still very low, less than 25%. So we want to make sure that we don't want ASEAN, or Malaysia for that matter, too much depend on our traditional partner, but we want to enlarge our market. We want to enlarge our friendship. That's why we are very keen to join BRICS and on the South, and after being postponed or for the last how many years? For the last time that our RCEP meeting was in 2020, so now 5 years lapsed. We're going to have our RCEP meeting, that is Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This is our economic agenda. We're going to have ATIGA also, and the best thing is that during this 47 summit, we're going to enhance our FTA arrangement, ASEAN-China FTA. We call it ASEAN-China FTA 3.0, because we want to streamline trade and investment, China with ASEAN member states. We don't want to undercut each other, so that we talk the same language, we offer the same incentive, so that ASEAN as a bloc will have a better better voice and a better presentation at the international stage.
Very quickly, you speak of one voice. When we look at the strategy for 2045, the Vision 2045, it talks about one vision, one identity. And to get there in 20 years, is that ambitious? And what are some of the challenges you think we might need to really push through to get that one voice, one identity for ASEAN as a bloc?
Before we can say about one voice, we have to put everything at par first. Not to say economically at par, but the inclusivity and the sustainability is our theme this year. That's why this year, 47 Summit, another history, that is Timor-Leste will be admitted as a full members of ASEAN. So that's why our inclusivity in 11 states, 11 countries as ASEAN members this year. So we want to make sure that connectivity been enhanced, connectivity, we put a proper footing, and as I mentioned just now, the second phase will be on economic factor. The economic sector will be our main agenda for the next 20 years. ASEAN was formed based on political, a platform, because we want to protect from the dominatory last time. But ASEAN now is more towards economic agenda as compared to politics. Because politics and security, I think we have already achieved a certain level of commitment by everybody. With country-to-country relationships is an excellent level. Arrangement on this defense cooperation is also a very good level already. Now that we want to see how best that ASEAN among ourselves, we treat among ourselves more as compared now that we are trading, we trade more than outside ASEAN community. So we want to enhance that. So how best that we can increase the intra-ASEAN economy by virtue of we want to improve the connectivity. That's why I want to have this ASEAN grid, all this kind of thing.
How, finally, very quickly, how aggressive are we towards that, and how fast do we want to move and gather partners as well?
We mean business. There's no look back. That's why during this opening of us as AMM in July, Prime Minister's mentioned that enough of declaration, enough of MOU, enough. But now it's time for us to translate it into action.
Thank you for your time, sir.
We'll be hearing more from Jessie Chahal throughout the week as she brings us live updates and key highlights from the 47th ASEAN Summit there at Kuala Lumpur Convention Centre. Now, Doctor, thanks for holding on. I want to go straight into it. When we're talking about current investment outlook, how would you describe ASEAN as the region and as it moves beyond this decade?
I definitely think that the ASEAN region has a lot of potential for investors. Maybe in the past, the region hasn't been particularly looked very heavily upon by the West, for instance, but I think that is actually changing. And of course, China sees great potential in ASEAN as well, as there are many companies that are actually being set up in this region from the Eastern supergiant. But at the same time, though, there are things that we have to look very carefully about also. For instance, if you're dealing with investment, I'm sure the investors actually want to be here, but are we having the right regulations? Are we coordinating things correctly in a way that gives them confidence is something that we need to look into. But I would say overall, there's a great deal of potential and investors are probably very eager to come in.
Now, you mentioned confidence, and we know that foreign direct investment into ASEAN has reached record levels in the last few years, and we're hoping to see more, especially in spaces like services, digital, manufacturing. Now, you said attractiveness. So why is ASEAN becoming increasingly attractive a destination for global investors?
I mean, when you look at it from the perspective of investors, one of the things you probably would ask is, if I'm an investor, what would I look for when I come into a particular country? So we're sort of doing a little role play over here. So I would look for a very lively workforce, a young enough workforce that's highly educated, people who are skilled, and then the correct infrastructure and logistics where I can actually transport goods and actually make sure that things can actually flow from A to B and stuff like that. Malaysia has a lot of that. Many ASEAN countries have lots of that. And so I would say that this is one of the things that really attract investors. And the fact that the growth level is still there. There's still a growth factor. I mean, if you're looking at the West, for instance, there is a lot of growth that occurred in the past, the Industrial Revolution, you're talking about tech boom and all that sort of stuff, but it's tapering, the growth. We still have that. And so as a result, this is what investors are definitely looking for.
So we're talking about vibrancy, infrastructure and logistics, growth, and you mentioned earlier about the need for governance and structures to allow for that confidence to be contained. Now, what would then be the single biggest investment risk for an investor going into ASEAN? What should they know?
I think coordination is the issue because you're looking at 10 different countries. And the question is, do all 10 have the same laws that govern investment coming from the outside? And then there's also the question of consistency within each country as well. So maybe one government says we're going to follow whatever everyone else is doing, and suddenly someone comes in and says, nope, that's not what we're going to do because there's national security issues and so on. So coordination within the region is one problem, but also ensuring national consistency in following these procedures and regulations is very important as well.
How do you perhaps see other geopolitical tensions like the US-China tech and trade competition for the South China Sea? Does that play as big of a role, or do you think coordination and policy governance would be the bigger problem?
I mean, right now the geopolitics is a very big issue, partly because the US is the way it is right now. I mean, if it were some other president, maybe this would be very different, but because Donald Trump is someone who is very bold in his actions and his words, it is very hard to say how these things would actually play out. Whatever he's trying to do will play out in this region. So geopolitics definitely plays a very important role, and I think one reason why the US president is here is to sort of talk terms with people. I'm sure these things were happening behind the scenes already, but definitely one of the US's main concern is ASEAN and different parts of the world being used, quote unquote, by China to sort of circumvent the tariffs that the U.S. is imposing on China. So I think this is one issue that the Malaysian government as well as the ASEAN community has to address, going forward. So yes, the geopolitics is very important right now. The governance issue is also, but geopolitics seems to take precedence at the moment.
So in your view, in terms of tactical strategy and play, we've got on the one hand the need to preserve and the other the need to project and boost, right? So if we're talking about ASEAN nations coming together both to preserve and to boost competitiveness and global uncertainties, how can we do this?
We have to come together, and I think this is what our foreign minister was basically saying. I mean, integration is a very important thing. Now, integration is important partly because if we're seen as a lonely island, we don't really have the authority or the power to sort of tell the US or any government, you know, this is what we want, this is what we think is actually possible, and so on. So this is the reason why the US president is very interested in using unilateral negotiations, because he knows that if he's doing one-on-one, he'll probably get the most benefit for the US. But if he's negotiating with a bloc, then that becomes more difficult because the bloc has more power and more say in some sense. So we need to preserve, well, we need to integrate, that's one thing. We keep talking about that, but how easy is that going to be is a big question. So that's why the foreign minister said something about 2045. And Jesse was asking, can we actually do that in 20 years? It could be, it's a very bold ambition. It's something that we would like to achieve, but whether we can actually do that is a different question. But yes, we definitely have to do that, and then we need to up our skill sets. We need to make sure that tech is something that we're really good at. Our workforce is actually going to be really, really strong and really, really skilled, so that foreign investors, when they come, they'll actually say, oh, well, I want to be in Malaysia, partly because they have a really vibrant workforce that's really, really skilled, and they have what I need.
And definitely, to quote the foreign minister, he did say that to get to one voice, we all have to be starting on the same plane. And clearly the different ASEAN nations to date are starting on different platforms or different levels of play. Now, when we're talking about ESG, we've been talking about environment, social governance, investments rising globally now. And in fact, there's a lot of debate over whether carbon credits and whether carbon sequestration is really a thing or whether it's just a whole load of greenwashing. Now, how is ASEAN aligning to sustainable investment trends?
I think we're moving there, but one of the things that I believe that we have to understand is a lot of the ESG trends, the green trends and all that came from the West. And of course, there's also the argument that the West has already achieved a certain level of development and therefore they can actually speak of things of the sort. Now, the Asian nations, especially Southeast Asia, many of us are still sort of moving up. So we are following these trends, and I think we want to be responsible global citizens at the same time. But I think we also have to ask ourselves, are we balancing national and regional interests with what the global trends set by the West supposedly are? So these are things that we need to sort of understand. But if you're looking at, say, Indonesia, if you're looking at Singapore, Malaysia, the sort of somewhat more advanced ASEAN countries, they are doing a lot for green tech. I mean, Singapore is very, very interested in making sure that the country goes green, that people are driving EV cars in the near future. Indonesia is investing a great deal in renewable energy, and Malaysia has things like green bonds, sukuk, and all that sort of stuff. So we are moving there, but maybe we will get there eventually at a faster pace when our development's actually on par with the West.
You brought up something that we actually mentioned during the Belanjawan debates on green sukuk financing. We know that ASEAN adopted the Regional Sustainable Finance Taxonomy end of last year. And of course, we've got countries that are already going down the green bonds and the green economy space. But when we're talking about national policies trying to sufficiently play catch-up game, realistically, do you think we'll reach 2045?
It's really hard to say. I mean, if Trump wasn't a factor, I would say we don't know. But if the US foreign policy right now and in the near future is that aggressive, I would say that we have no choice. And so basically, when you're being coerced into a corner, you have no choice but to do something in return. So I think this is one of the things that we actually need, the factor that we actually need to sort of come together.
So it's less likely of an if and more of a when.
I would say so, yes.
Now, if we're talking about specific policy reforms, and we know that there are cross-border collaborations that are happening, that's crucial to, of course, ASEAN's sustaining investor confidence. What are some of the things that we want to see? Either, harmonizing disclosure, upgrading investment protection rules. Is there sort of like a single window? I know that there is no silver bullet, but what are the themes that we should be prioritizing in the near future?
So I would say if I'm putting on my quote-unquote investor's cap, if I'm coming in with like multi-million-dollar projects or $1 billion or whatever it may be, what would I like to see from ASEAN? Well, for one, I want transparency. I would like to know what the rules are and ensuring that coordination is actually done appropriately. Because if I'm bringing in lots of money and you're telling me that I need to talk to 10 different agencies, then that is one problem, I would say. But I think the other thing is that we need to understand is ASEAN can harness its cohesiveness, if we can actually achieve that, in order to gain greater traction with foreign investors. Because if an investor comes in with a couple of billion US dollars into Malaysia, and they're following all the rules that the Malaysian government has basically set in order to set up a business over here. And if, let's say, all the other neighboring countries that we have in ASEAN follow the same rules as well. So what it basically means is if you know the rules of one country and you're complying with that, you're also complying with everyone else. So that basically enlarges your market share. So with that same amount of money you're investing in one country, it could potentially lead to more investments in other countries because there's coordination. The governance structure is the same and so on. So we definitely need these sort of things in order to be moving in the right direction.
So that harmonization is key on whether or not we choose to help services have the necessary protection in place or investment liberalization as well as we move forward. Now let's talk about SMEs, right? Because I think the whole ASEAN has got a very vibrant local SME scene, and it's also the dominant factor of who's in the market and the industry. Now we know that we spoke about structured capture of more value and of course rising regional and foreign investments, but what should governments do to protect and also help flourish the SME industry in the region?
So we want to attract a lot of investment, but the problem with that is if they're coming from a high vantage point where their technology is great, their skill set is great, can they actually come in and sort of play ball with the local industry? So would they displace the local industries going forward? That is a very big question that we all have. Governments would definitely have. So I think in order for foreign investors to come to Malaysia and say, we want your workforce, we want the local supply chain to be used in supplying our needs, and we want all your skill sets, then we definitely need to point towards one direction, which is we need to upskill the workforce. So this is where the TVET, where the universities, the local education structure has to conform to these sort of demands coming from the outside. And this is one of the catalysts for us to change ourselves as well.
How do we perhaps balance, as far as the SME scene is concerned, how do we balance between high tech and AI and low resource settings and perhaps low tech services?
I think if you're looking at what China is doing recently, especially when they're moving to their 15th five-year plan, one of the things they're looking at, and they've been talking about this, is how do you basically upskill low-skill sectors? So you're moving to automation, you're talking about digitization, you're talking about retraining and things of the sort. So China recognizes what the future is like, and we should also. So when looking at the SMEs, I think there's a lot of potential in terms of what they're actually doing. And they can actually upskill or basically improve the products they're actually selling if they have the right skill sets and the right tools for that. So I think what the government has to do is to actually look very closely into channeling whatever subsidies we're saving into retraining people in the SME structure and making sure that appropriate subsidies are there to help them rebrand themselves and restructure themselves so that they can actually compete in the international market.
You mentioned subsidies. So I wanted to ask about the access to finance for SMEs or micro-entrepreneurs in the region. Are there potentially, efforts that are looking at cross-border financing for different types of services, or is it predominantly housed by national actions?
I think for now it's definitely housed by national agencies. You're not really talking about the international cross-border financing, and part of the reason is because you're dealing with very different governance structures, different political structures, and so when you're dealing with so much discrepancy, how is it possible or easily done, to sort of finance, household in Cambodia for an SME project when you're here in Malaysia? It's actually very difficult.
Definitely. But we are seeing quite a lot more ecosystem building type of projects, especially for environment and social entrepreneurships coming out of MSMEs. So I think it'll be hopeful to see where they go. So since you talked about how to entice investors, I wanted to ask you, if you were advising a new investor coming into ASEAN today, which country or perhaps what sector would you recommend and why?
Well, it depends on what you want to do. I mean, if you're looking at Thailand, for instance, they're very vibrant in their manufacturing industry. I mean, many of the cars that we see in the ASEAN region are actually being built in Thailand. If you're looking at renewable energy, you're looking at Indonesia, looking at tech, IT, Singapore, Malaysia are very, very strong. Malaysia's semiconductor potential is actually very high. We're actually pretty good in that industry. So it really depends, but there's definitely a very vibrant potential for these people to come in and look into different areas with a very, very powerful and very highly educated and skilled workforce.
What do you think perhaps for industries like renewable energy and EV? You mentioned semiconductors, but what about other things like digital services or R&D hubs perhaps?
Yeah, I would say that Malaysia, for instance, is moving that direction. Singapore, for sure, is doing things of the sort. We are definitely moving in that direction as a region. Of course, the richer, wealthier, higher income countries in ASEAN have the ability to do that, and then the so-called less affluent nations may actually struggle a little bit. And this is one reason why I think ASEAN really struggles for integration again, because the economic structure is very, very different. But there's definitely something for any investor to actually obtain and actually achieve when they come to the ASEAN region, and it depends on what they want.
So if we're talking about boosting confidence quickly, what would be the, I suppose, fiscal and regulatory reforms that we should be looking at?
I mean, we're looking at coordination. Again, when you're looking at ASEAN as a region, you're looking at whether we have the same governance structure and whether they're binding. I think the question is, can we actually make sure they're binding? So you can actually say, yes, we're going to do this, we're going to do A, B, C, D, E, and he's going to do A, B, C, D, E, and she's going to do A, B, C, D, E, A, B, C, D, E. But the question is, are they really going to do that? So I think, unlike a political union like the EU, where there's a very top-down structure where it says, we're going to do this as a region, there are things you can do on your own, but you have to follow, otherwise there are repercussions. And so can we actually move in a direction where we tell people, you have to do this, otherwise you're not part of the union anymore, and then we don't want you.
Do you foresee that ASEAN is going to be able to do that? Because ASEAN is not short of declarations. We've got many different types of declarations, many different types of promises of working together. But like you rightly pointed out, we need perhaps teeth to some of these declarations to ensure that there is a governance process in place and there is, I guess, repercussions, like you said, if something is not met. It could be anything from preserving the environment to helping the most vulnerable to the population or regional security. Do you believe that ASEAN has what it takes to be moving in that direction?
I'm sure given enough time, we always have the potential of achieving anything. But the question is, why is it so difficult? I would say one reason why this is a very major difficulty is because the economic structures and potential of each country is so different. The question is, would a place like Cambodia, for instance, or Laos, want to necessarily have a structure like that, where an economic union is in place, where everyone has to follow the same sets of rules? The question is about fairness and justice. You can do certain things. Like we would talk about why are we having green tech, why is ESG regulations in place and all that. Some might argue it's because the West has basically dictated that they're doing this, and so we have to follow in order to play ball. So then the question is it fair to actually do things of this sort? And the answer is maybe, maybe not. But the question is, do ASEAN countries have the will to come together? And a lot of that has to we have to factor in the economic side of things.
You mentioned fairness and justice. I wrote that down because I think that's key here. Now, if ASEAN leaders could focus on just one priority, if we're talking about ensuring that there's sustained growth and regional integration over the next, say, decade, but at the same time upholding that fairness and justice, what would that be?
Integration. I would say that is the one word.
So back to inclusivity and sustainability.
It's always about that. I think in order for people to want to join the club and actually follow its rules, they have to feel that they're part of it. And I think that's where integration plays a very important role.
What do you foresee then in the next few years with Timor-Leste joining the ASEAN? What would be one of the things that we can do to assist this new member that's part of the region?
I think we should definitely show them, what other benefits of actually joining ASEAN would be. And in order to do that, we have to keep the ASEAN house in order. So basically, we have to follow the rules that we actually set. We have to basically follow through our promises. And that's where a member like Timor-Leste or maybe other places would actually find that this place is a credible organization to be with.
Thank you so much for joining us, but that's all the time that we have today on The Nation ASEAN Plus. Dr. Tan Chee Meng, Assistant Professor of Business Economics at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Thank you for joining us. For more updates on ASEAN development, of course, visit us on the ASEAN page at bernama.com and keep logging in on Bernama TV for the latest and what's happening in the summit. Now, I'm Nadia ABDUL, and this is The Nation ASEAN Plus. Take care.